Two Republicans who voted to impeach former President Trump are facing tough primaries today in Washington state. Representative Jaime Herrera Butler is facing off against Trump-backed candidate Joe Kent in the state's 3rd district. Kent is a former Green Beret who has repeated the former president's falsehoods about the 2020 election. And in central Washington's 4th district, Representative Neuhaus is also facing a candidate endorsed by Mr. Trump after voting to impeach him. In this case, it's Lauren Culp. You see him on the right. For more, we're joined now by David Gutman, who is a political reporter for the Seattle Times, and he joins us from, I kid you not, Battleground, Washington. David, great to have you with us. My first question for you is about Representative Jaime Herrera Butler facing apparently an uphill battle of keeping her seat after being one of these few Republicans who voted to impeach the former president. What can you tell us about why her schedule seems to be relatively light considering this fight ahead?
Well, yeah, she is in a tough race here and in a struggle to get through the primary, which is today. She has been having a relatively light in-person campaign schedule. Just, she's been advertising and buying ads, but, there are no in-person town halls, very few in-person events. It seems like there might be fears of, of being shouted down or kind of confrontations at in-person events, but it's been a pretty light schedule.
And our viewers should be aware, as a working reporter, you're out in some of the restaurants, whether they be high-end or fast food, as the cars zoom by, just so our viewers give you some slack here. He's a working man. Speaking of those who voted to impeach the former president, Representative Neuhaus is one of those 10 Republicans. Most don't think of Washington as a necessarily conservative state, but how is that decision impacting voters' choices?
Well, on the whole, you're right. Washington is not a conservative state, but there's a pretty deep divide. Basically, the Cascade Mountains run down the middle of the state, and east of the Cascades is solidly Republican territory, and that's where Dan Newhouse is. And both him and Jaime Herrera Butler are facing crowded fields of far-right challengers who have challenged them, primarily over their votes to impeach Donald Trump. And we're going to see today, with today's primary, whether they'll have enough support to survive. One thing actually that's interesting about Washington's primaries is that there's no Democratic primary and Republican primary. Every candidate is in one big primary, and the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party, move on to the general election. And that's something that actually could work to the advantage of the 2 incumbents. They could get enough, moderate Republican and even Democratic support that they could be able to fend off the far-right challengers.
David, that's a really important distinction you make there when it comes to which voters are enticed and encouraged to come to the polls and what the candidates are encouraged to suggest and support in order to court them. A special election is being held for Washington's Secretary of State. What can you tell us about that race and what it tells us about what's happening in the country?
Well, yeah, it's a special election because Washington, as I said, is a Democratic state, but for many years had a Republican Secretary of State. She was a quite moderate Republican and, in fact, left office to take a job in the Biden administration doing election security. She was replaced with a Democratic appointee. So the current Secretary of State is a Democrat named Steve Hobbs. He's facing a crowded field of challengers, a couple moderate Republicans, a couple Republicans who are very extreme in their, how they discuss the 2020 election and throwing around false statements about, fraud in the 2020 election. I think what we'll be telling is which Republican manages to get through to the general election. I think it's very likely that the Democrat Steve Hobbs will make it through, but who his opponent is might tell us a little bit about the state of the electorate.
Certainly, we'll continue to watch this closely. David Gutman, going where the people are, no matter where that is. We appreciate your time today. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.